The silk tie had come from Prague, navy blue with thin silver threads that caught the light when he turned just right. Alan Foster had worn it to his own wedding 23 years earlier, standing at the altar with trembling hands and a heart so full he thought it might burst. He'd promised Linda that morning over coffee in their new apartment with boxes still stacked against the walls, that he'd wear it again someday when their children got married, or when his brother's kids took their vows, or at any occasion important enough to warrant the finest thing he owned. That day arrived on the first Saturday of June in 2014, warm and cloudless, the kind of morning that made you grateful to be alive. The air in their quiet Ohio suburb smelled like fresh-cut grass and charcoal from someone's early barbecue, and the neighborhood hummed with the soft weekend sounds of sprinklers clicking across lawns and screen doors banging shut. Their house on Maple Ridge sat tucked between two oak trees that had been there longer than the street itself, their branches reaching over the roof like protective arms. Inside, the morning moved with comfortable rhythm. Linda had pressed Alan's white dress shirt the night before, smoothing out every wrinkle with the care she brought to small tasks, and she'd hung it on the back of the closet door so he wouldn't forget it. By 9 o'clock, the coffee maker gurgled its last drops into the pot. The family dog scratched lazily at the screen door, wanting out, and their 15-year-old son Kyle still slept upstairs, buried under his comforter, the way teenagers do on weekend mornings when no one forces them awake. Alan came downstairs, showered and clean-shaven, his damp hair combed back, smelling faintly of the aftershave Linda had given him last Christmas. He poured himself a cup of coffee, added 2 sugars the way he always did, and leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone while he drank. Linda asked if he was nervous about the speech. Alan's nephew had asked him to say a few words at the reception, something about family and new beginnings, and Alan said no. He had it all worked out in his head. He kissed her on the forehead, a gesture so familiar and routine that neither of them thought twice about it, and told her he'd see her at the church in an hour. He wanted to get there early, he said, to help his brother with last-minute setup. She reminded him not to forget the card they'd signed for the bride and groom, and he grabbed it from the counter, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and smiled at her one last time. Then he picked up his keys from the ceramic dish by the front door, the same dish they'd bought at a farmer's market years ago, chipped now on one side, but still serving its purpose, and walked out into the June sunshine. Linda heard the car door slam. She heard the engine turn over, smooth and reliable, the way the Honda always started. She heard the sound of tires on asphalt, fading down the block, blending into the ambient noise of a Saturday morning in the suburbs. And then, nothing. He never arrived at the church. He never called to say he'd be late. He never sent a text to explain. He simply vanished, as if the 10-minute drive between home and ceremony had opened up and swallowed him whole. For 9 years, that navy silk tie vanished along with the man who wore it, becoming a ghost object in a ghost story, until the afternoon a shopkeeper named Florence Brennan saw Kyle Foster standing at a downtown crosswalk, the same tie knotted loosely around his neck, 3 dark streaks running across the silk like dried rust, and everything that had been buried started clawing its way back to the surface. The wedding was set to begin at 11 sharp. Linda arrived at the church a little before 10:30 with her mother and a cardboard box filled with white roses she'd picked up from the florist that morning. The church sat on a corner lot, surrounded by hedges and a gravel parking area that crunched underfoot, and the front doors were propped open to let in the breeze. Inside, the sanctuary smelled like furniture polish and old hymnals, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows in soft blues and golds. Linda found a spot in the 4th pew on the bride's side, set the box of roses on the seat beside her, and kept glancing toward the back entrance, expecting to see Alan slip in at any moment. She pictured him coming through the doors slightly out of breath, loosening his tie and flashing that apologetic grin he always wore when he cut things a little too close. But the minutes ticked by, and the pews filled with guests, and Alan's seat remained empty. At 11, the organist began the prelude, a soft, rolling melody that signaled everyone to quiet down and turn their attention forward. The doors at the back opened again, this time for the bridesmaids in their pale green dresses, and then the bride herself, radiant and nervous, clutching her father's arm. Linda watched the ceremony unfold, the vows, the rings, the kiss, the recessional, but her mind was somewhere else. She pulled out her phone during the recessional and sent Alan a text. "Where are you?" No response. She sent another during the cocktail hour, while guests milled around in the fellowship hall, nibbling cheese cubes and crackers. "Call me." Getting worried. Still nothing. She called his phone twice, and both times it rang 6 times before clicking over to voicemail, his recorded voice cheerful and maddeningly normal. "You've reached Alan. Leave a message." By the time the reception started, worry had shoved irritation completely aside and taken up permanent residence in her chest. Alan's brother, the groom's father, pulled Linda aside near the gift table and asked in a low voice if everything was all right at home. She told him she didn't know. She told him Alan had left the house over 2 hours ago and should have been the first one here. His brother frowned, glanced at his watch, and suggested they retrace the route Alan would have taken. Linda agreed immediately, grateful to be doing something, anything, other than sitting still and pretending everything was fine. They left the reception and climbed into his brother's truck, and he drove slowly down Maple Ridge, the same street Alan would have taken that morning. They scanned the sidewalks, checked the parking lots of the gas station and the small strip mall near the freeway on-ramp, circled back to the church lot to see if maybe Alan had parked in some far corner and walked somewhere on foot. The car wasn't there. Alan wasn't there. They drove the route 3 times, widening the search radius each time, peering down side streets and into the empty lot behind the old hardware store. Nothing. By 3 in the afternoon, Linda's hands were shaking, and her brother-in-law said the words she'd been trying not to think. "We should call the police." And if you're watching this story unfold and wondering how a man can disappear in broad daylight on a sunny Saturday morning in a quiet suburb where everyone knows everyone, you're not alone. Go ahead and hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this case baffled not just a family, but an entire community for nearly a decade. The responding officer met Linda and her brother-in-law in the church parking lot, his patrol car idling near the curb, and he took the report standing beside his vehicle with his notepad balanced on the hood. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a patient expression and a methodical way of asking questions. He wrote down Alan's full name, his date of birth, his physical description: 47 years old, 6 feet tall, brown hair starting to grey at the temples, brown eyes, no visible scars or tattoos, last seen wearing a white dress shirt, grey slacks, black dress shoes, and a navy and silver silk tie. He wrote down the make and model of Alan's car, a silver 2011 Honda Accord, and the license plate number Linda recited from memory. He asked if Alan had seemed upset that morning, if there had been any kind of argument or tension in the house, if he'd mentioned stopping anywhere on the way to the church, if he had any history of mental health issues or substance abuse, if there were any problems in the marriage. Linda answered no to all of it, her voice steady, but her hands twisting the strap of her purse into knots. Alan had been in a good mood. He'd hummed while he poured his coffee. He'd kissed her goodbye. There had been no warning, no sign, no reason to think anything was wrong. The officer nodded, radioed in the vehicle description and plate number, and told Linda that the vast majority of missing adult cases resolve within 48 hours. "People get flat tires," he said. "Phones die. Sometimes they just need space and don't think to call." Linda didn't believe him. Something in her gut told her this was different. But she nodded anyway, because what else could she do? By evening, when Alan still hadn't returned and still hadn't called, the officer escalated the case to the detective division. A detective named Paul Grayson took over, a man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of gentle eyes that had seen too much but still cared anyway. He called Linda that night and asked if he could come by the house to ask a few more questions, and she said yes. He arrived just after 8, stepping carefully through the front door, as if he understood he was entering a space that had already been violated by absence. He sat with Linda and Kyle at the kitchen table, the same table where Alan had eaten breakfast that morning, and asked them to walk him through the day one more time. Kyle, who'd woken up around noon to find his mother gone and the house eerily quiet, said he hadn't heard his father leave. He hadn't heard anything. The last time he'd spoken to his dad was Friday night. Something about fixing the latch on the back gate, something Kyle had answered with a distracted, "Yeah, sure," while scrolling through his phone. He wished now that he'd looked up. Paul Grayson took notes, asked about Alan's job, his friends, his habits, his routines. Linda answered everything she could. Alan worked as a civil engineer for a firm downtown. He'd been there 12 years. He liked his job. He got along with his co-workers. He didn't gamble, didn't drink heavily, didn't have debts she knew about. He went to the gym twice a week. He watched baseball on weekends. He was predictable, steady, the kind of man who showed up when he said he would. Paul Grayson listened, nodded, and promised he'd do everything he could. Over the next 72 hours, Paul Grayson ran Alan Foster's name through every database he had access to. He checked state and national criminal records, hospital admissions, arrest logs, accident reports from surrounding counties. He contacted the highway patrol to see if any incidents had been reported on the routes Alan might have taken. He requested Alan's phone records and found nothing unusual, no strange numbers, no pattern of calls that raised red flags. The last call Alan had made was 3 days earlier to his brother, confirming the time of the wedding. The last text he'd sent was to Linda the night before, a simple good night with a smiley face. Paul checked Alan's bank accounts with Linda's permission and found that none of them had been touched since Friday. His credit cards hadn't been used. His ATM card hadn't been swiped. It was as if Alan Foster had decided to stop existing in every measurable, traceable way. Paul requested Alan's medical records and found nothing that suggested a cognitive event. No history of strokes, no seizures, no early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's. He interviewed Alan's co-workers at the engineering firm and got the same answer from every single one of them. Alan was reliable, friendly, good at his job, showed no signs of stress or distress. He interviewed neighbors on Maple Ridge, and they all said the same thing. Alan mowed his lawn on Saturdays. He waved when you drove past. He helped old Mrs. Kowalski carry her groceries once when her car broke down. He was just a normal guy, a good guy, the kind of guy who didn't vanish. The first organized search began on Sunday morning, less than 48 hours after Alan disappeared. Paul Grayson coordinated with the local fire department and put out a call for volunteers, and nearly 60 people showed up at the high school parking lot at dawn. Linda stood in the center of the crowd, her face pale and her eyes ringed with sleeplessness, and thanked them all for coming. Paul divided the volunteers into teams and handed out maps marked with grid coordinates, instructing each team to cover a specific zone within a 10-mile radius of Alan's home and the church. They were told to look for anything: clothing, a wallet, a phone, signs of a struggle, tire marks, anything that seemed out of place. A K9 unit from the county sheriff's office arrived with 2 tracking dogs, German shepherds trained in search and rescue, and the handlers started at Alan's driveway, hoping the dogs could pick up a scent trail. The dogs sniffed the ground, noses working, and began pulling their handlers east down Maple Ridge. They moved quickly at first, confident, but 3 blocks later they stopped abruptly at the corner of Maple and Vine, circled in confusion, and sat down. The handlers tried again, but the dogs found nothing. It was as if Alan's scent had simply ended mid-block, as if he'd evaporated into the air. The search teams fanned out across the grid, walking slowly through roadside ditches thick with weeds and wildflowers, through the wooded lots behind the shopping centre where teenagers sometimes drank on Friday nights, through the narrow trails that wound through the nature preserve south of town, where families took their dogs on Sunday afternoons. They called Alan's name until their voices went hoarse. They checked abandoned buildings, checked dumpsters, checked the edges of retention ponds and drainage culverts. They found a rusted bicycle frame half buried in the mud. They found a torn garbage bag filled with old clothes. They found one waterlogged sneaker that didn't match Alan's size. They didn't find Alan. By late afternoon, the volunteers were exhausted and discouraged, and Paul Grayson called them back to the parking lot. He stood on the tailgate of a pickup truck and thanked them all, his voice rough with fatigue, and told them to go home and rest. He promised he'd organize another search if new information surfaced, if someone called in a tip, if anything changed. But nothing changed. The case, barely a few days old, was already beginning to cool. On Monday morning, flyers went up all over town. Linda and Kyle spent hours at the library making copies, Alan's face printed in black and white above the word "missing" in bold letters, followed by his description, the date he disappeared, and a phone number to call with information. They taped the flyers to telephone poles, to the bulletin boards at the grocery store and the coffee shop and the post office, to the windows of businesses that agreed to display them. Alan's face stared out from every corner, and for a few days it felt like progress, like doing something meant something. The local news ran a segment on the evening broadcast, 30 seconds of footage showing Linda standing in front of her house, pleading for anyone with information to come forward, followed by a slow pan across one of the flyers. The tip line Paul Grayson had set up started ringing. In the first 48 hours, 17 calls came in. 11 were from neighbors and acquaintances expressing concern and offering prayers, but providing no useful information. 4 were sightings of silver Honda Accords that turned out to belong to other people. 2 were from self-appointed detectives convinced that Alan had staged his own disappearance, though neither could offer a reason why. None of the calls led anywhere. By the end of the first week, the tip line had gone quiet. By the end of the second week, the news had moved on to other stories. Alan Foster became just another name, just another face, just another family trapped in the suffocating limbo of not knowing. Linda and Kyle returned to a house that no longer felt like home. Everything inside was exactly the way Alan had left it, his jacket still hanging on the coat hook by the door, his reading glasses folded on the coffee table next to a book he'd been halfway through, his coffee mug still sitting in the sink from Saturday morning, a faint brown ring dried at the bottom. Linda couldn't bring herself to wash it. She couldn't bring herself to move any of it. She walked through the rooms, touching his things like talismans, as if keeping them exactly where he'd left them might somehow summon him back. Kyle moved through the house like a shadow, silent and withdrawn. He kept replaying that last conversation with his father, the one about fixing the gate latch, the one he'd answered without looking up from his phone. He wished he'd said something else. He wished he'd said anything else. He wished he'd told his father he loved him, even though they'd never been the kind of family that said it out loud very often. Now he didn't know if he'd ever get the chance. Friends and extended family rallied in the beginning, the way people do when tragedy is fresh and shock hasn't yet given way to the dull ache of prolonged grief. They brought casseroles and lasagnas and Tupperwares full of cookies, filling Linda's refrigerator with food she didn't have the appetite to eat. They sat with her in the living room and said things like, "He'll turn up," and "Try to stay positive," and "Let us know if you need anything," and Linda nodded and thanked them and felt more alone than ever. Relatives called every day for the first week, then every few days, then once a week, then not at all. It wasn't that they stopped caring, it was that they didn't know what to say anymore, and silence felt easier than the awkwardness of asking, "Any news?" when the answer was always no. Paul Grayson visited every few days, sitting at the kitchen table with Linda and going over the case file, walking her through everything he'd done and everything he was still doing, which was considerable but yielded nothing. He submitted Alan's information to the FBI's National Crime Information Center. He entered Alan's DNA profile into the National Missing and Unidentified Person System in case unidentified remains ever surfaced that matched. He contacted neighboring police departments and state agencies, casting the net as wide as he could. He did everything by the book, followed every protocol, pursued every lead no matter how thin. But the book didn't have answers for cases like this, cases where a man simply ceased to exist without evidence, without explanation, without a single clue. By the end of June, Linda had used up all her vacation days and her paid leave, and her supervisor at the library gently suggested she take an unpaid leave of absence to focus on the search. Linda agreed, even though there was no search left to focus on. The organized efforts had ended, the volunteers had gone back to their lives, the news had moved on. All that remained was the waiting, the endless soul-crushing waiting, and Linda quickly discovered that waiting wasn't something you could do actively. It was something that happened to you passively, while the rest of the world kept turning. She tried to fill her days with purpose. She called Paul Grayson twice a week asking for updates. She drove the route between her house and the church over and over, as if repetition might reveal something she'd missed. She joined online forums for families of missing persons and read stories that were both comforting and devastating in their familiarity. She wasn't alone in this nightmare, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to endure. Kyle started his sophomore year of high school that fall, and everything about it felt wrong. His friends tried to be supportive, but they were 15 and 16 years old and didn't know how to talk about something this heavy, so they mostly avoided it. Teachers knew what had happened. It had been in the news, after all, and they gave Kyle sympathetic looks in the hallways and extended deadlines when he didn't turn in assignments, but their pity only made him feel more isolated. He used to raise his hand in class, used to crack jokes with his friends at lunch, used to stay after school for chess club and debate team. Now he sat in the back row with his headphones in and his hood up, blocking out the world. He stopped going to chess club. He stopped going to debate team. He stopped going anywhere that wasn't absolutely mandatory. At home, he spent hours in his room with the door closed, and when Linda knocked to ask if he wanted dinner or if he needed anything, he'd say he was fine, even though they both knew he wasn't. She didn't push. She barely had the energy to take care of herself, let alone pull her son out of the darkness he was sinking into. In October, Linda started seeing a therapist. Her doctor had suggested it back in July, and Linda had resisted at first. She wasn't the one who needed help. Alan was the one who was missing. But by October, the weight of it all had become unbearable, and she finally made the call. The therapist's name was Dr. Ellison, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and a calm, steady voice, and she specialized in something Linda had never heard of before: ambiguous loss. Dr. Ellison explained that ambiguous loss was a type of grief that occurred when a loved one was physically absent but still psychologically present, or vice versa, and that it was one of the most difficult forms of trauma to endure because there was no closure, no finality, no way to move forward or let go. Linda sat in Dr. Ellison's office and cried for the first time since Alan disappeared, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, and Dr. Ellison sat quietly and let her cry. Over the following weeks and months, Dr. Ellison taught Linda coping strategies, how to create small rituals of remembrance, how to set boundaries around her grief so it didn't consume her entirely, how to accept the uncertainty without letting it destroy her. It helped a little, but it didn't bring Alan back. It didn't answer the question that haunted her every waking moment. Where is he? The holidays that year were unbearable. Thanksgiving came, and Linda couldn't bring herself to cook, couldn't bear the thought of sitting at the table with Alan's chair empty, so she and Kyle ordered Chinese food and ate it in front of the television in silence. Christmas was worse. Linda stood in the garage, holding the box of decorations, the lights they always strung along the porch railing, the wreath they hung on the front door, the stockings they hung from the mantel, and couldn't decide if putting them up would honor Alan or mock his absence. She compromised. She put up the tree, a small one in the corner of the living room, and hung 3 stockings, hers, Kyle's, and Alan's. She filled hers and Kyle's with small gifts and candy. Alan's stayed empty, a silent acknowledgement of the space he'd left behind. On Christmas morning, she and Kyle exchanged gifts without much enthusiasm, and afterward they sat in the living room staring at the tree and not talking. That night, Linda took down Alan's stocking and put it away. It hurt too much to look at. Paul Grayson hadn't given up, even when the case went cold, even when months passed without a single new lead. Missing persons cases were the hardest part of his job, the ones that kept him awake at night long after he'd clocked out and gone home. Most cases resolved quickly. Runaways came home, adults in crisis were located, bodies were found. But every once in a while, a case like Alan Foster's came along, a case that defied logic and explanation, and those were the ones that haunted him. He kept Alan's file on his desk, kept revisiting it, kept looking for the detail he might have missed. He expanded his search to neighboring states, filed additional reports with regional law enforcement agencies, contacted hospitals and homeless shelters and rehabilitation centers, asking if anyone matching Alan's description had been admitted or had sought help. He came up empty every time. In late 2015, more than a year after Alan disappeared, Paul sat down with Linda again and walked her through that Saturday morning one more time, hoping that a detail might shake loose, some small thing she'd forgotten or overlooked. Linda told him the same story she'd told a dozen times before. Alan had been calm. He'd been happy. He'd hummed while he poured his coffee. He'd kissed her goodbye. There had been no warning. Paul believed her. But belief didn't solve cases. Evidence did. And there wasn't any. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of monotonous grief. 2015 became 2016. Kyle turned 16 and got his driver's license and started working part-time at a hardware store on the east side of town. Not because the family needed the money. Linda had gone back to work at the library, and they were managing on her salary plus savings. But because Kyle needed to be somewhere other than the house. He needed structure. He needed distraction. He needed to stop thinking about the fact that his father had left for a wedding one Saturday morning and had never come back, and that no one could tell him why. He grew quieter as he grew older, more withdrawn, more guarded. His friends from high school drifted away, moving on to college or jobs or lives that didn't include space for someone carrying the weight Kyle carried. He didn't blame them. He wouldn't have known how to be around himself either. 2016 became 2017. Alan's case remained open but inactive, filed in a cabinet in the detective division alongside dozens of other unsolved disappearances. Paul Grayson retired in the spring of 2020, and on his last day he handed Alan Foster's file to a younger detective named Isabel Tran, a woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a reputation for being thorough. She read through the file cover to cover, found it meticulously organized and utterly barren of useful leads, and called Linda to introduce herself. She promised she'd give the case a fresh look, that she wouldn't let it gather dust, that she'd keep searching. Linda thanked her, but by that point gratitude felt like an automatic reflex rather than genuine hope. She'd learned not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope hurt. Life went on because it had to. Linda worked at the library 5 days a week, cataloguing books and helping patrons, and moving through her routines with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd learned to function on autopilot. Kyle graduated high school in 2017 and enrolled in community college, studying business administration without much enthusiasm or direction. He didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, and he didn't particularly care. The house on Maple Ridge stayed frozen in small ways. Alan's coat still hung on the hook by the door. His toothbrush still sat in the holder in the bathroom. His name still appeared on the mailbox out front. Linda couldn't bring herself to remove any of it, and Kyle never asked her to. They learned to live around the absence the way you learn to live around a permanent injury. You adjust, you compensate, you keep going, even when every step reminds you of what you've lost. The turn, when it finally came, arrived not with fanfare or drama, but with the quiet, bureaucratic efficiency of a database cross-reference. It happened in the spring of 2023, 9 years after Alan Foster walked out of his house and vanished. A clerk in the state's Department of Human Services named Rita Alvarez was processing a backlog of Medicaid applications when the system flagged an inconsistency. 2 individuals with the same social security number. It was a red flag that usually indicated clerical error or identity theft, and Rita's job was to investigate and resolve the discrepancy. She pulled both files. One belonged to Alan Foster, a civil engineer from the suburbs, flagged as missing since June 2014. The other belonged to a man named David Callahan, who had been receiving state benefits in a small town called Rivermouth, 200 miles north, since late 2014. Rita compared the birth dates. They matched. She compared the physical descriptions. 6 feet tall, brown hair, brown eyes. Close enough. She compared the social security numbers digit by digit. Identical. Rita flagged the case and forwarded it to the Fraud Investigation Unit, which forwarded it to law enforcement, which eventually landed on Isabel Tran's desk on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Isabel pulled both files and spread them across her desk, her pulse quickening as she read. David Callahan had appeared in Rivermouth in the autumn of 2014, just a few months after Alan Foster disappeared. He'd walked into a homeless shelter claiming to be a transient worker with no family, no permanent address, and no memory of his life before a head injury he said he'd sustained while hitchhiking. The shelter had taken him in, helped him apply for a social security card replacement using the number he'd been able to recite from memory, and enrolled him in temporary assistance programs. From there, David Callahan had been placed in subsidized housing, had found part-time work doing maintenance at a local church, and had been living quietly under that name for 9 years. Isabel Tran stared at the file, her mind racing. It was possible this was a coincidence, a case of stolen identity. It was also possible this was Alan Foster. She picked up the phone and called Linda. The conversation was careful, measured, precise. Isabel explained the situation, the database match, the man in Rivermouth, the shared social security number, and stressed that it was still just a possibility, that they'd need to verify, that Linda shouldn't get her hopes up until they knew for certain. Linda's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. She asked if she could see him. If she could drive up there right now, if she could. Isabel cut her off gently and said, "Not yet." Protocol required that they verify identity first. They'd start with a photograph comparison. If the photo matched, they'd request fingerprints and DNA confirmation. Once they were certain, they'd arrange a meeting. Linda asked how long that would take. Isabel said a few days, maybe a week. Linda said she'd waited 9 years. She could wait another week. But the waiting was different now. It wasn't the empty, hopeless waiting that had defined the last 9 years. It was sharp and urgent and terrifying, because hope, when it returns after such a long absence, feels less like relief and more like a wound tearing open all over again. Isabel Tran drove to Rivermouth the next morning with her partner, a detective named Marcus Cole, and a photograph of Alan Foster from 2014. Rivermouth was a small town built along the bend of a river, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. They found the address listed for David Callahan, a low-income apartment complex on the edge of town, a set of brick buildings with peeling paint and a chain-link fence surrounding a courtyard of patchy grass and cracked pavement. Isabel and Marcus walked to apartment 12 and knocked. The man who answered was wearing jeans and a faded grey t-shirt, and his hair was longer than in the photo, streaked with more grey. But his face, the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, was unmistakable. Isabel held up her badge and introduced herself. The man looked confused, but not alarmed, not defensive. He invited them inside. The apartment was small and tidy. A couch with a crocheted blanket folded over one arm, a folding table and 2 chairs, a hot plate on the counter, a shelf of second-hand paperbacks arranged by height. It was the home of someone who owned very little, but took care of what he had. Isabel asked if he'd ever gone by the name Alan Foster. The man frowned, his brow furrowing, and said he didn't think so, but that he'd had memory problems since his injury and couldn't be sure. She asked if he remembered anything from before 2014. He shook his head. Nothing, he said. It was all blank. She asked if he'd be willing to provide fingerprints and a DNA sample for identification purposes. He said sure, if it would help. They collected both, thanked him for his cooperation, and left. 3 days later, the lab results came back. Fingerprints matched, DNA matched. David Callahan was Alan Foster. Isabel called Linda on a Thursday afternoon and delivered the news in the calmest voice she could manage. Linda sat down on the floor of her kitchen and wept. Kyle, who'd been in his room, came downstairs and found his mother on the floor with the phone pressed to her ear, and he knew immediately that something had changed. Linda looked up at him with tears streaming down her face and said, "They found him. They found your father." Kyle's legs gave out, and he sat down beside her, and for the first time in 9 years, they held each other and cried. The encounter, when it finally happened, took place in a conference room at the police station in Rivermouth, a neutral space with fluorescent lights and a long table and chairs that felt too institutional for something so profoundly personal. Linda asked Kyle if he wanted to come with her, and Kyle said he did. But when they arrived at the station and Isabel led them down the hallway toward the conference room, Kyle stopped outside the door and told his mother to go in first. He wasn't ready. He didn't know if he'd ever be ready. Linda nodded, squeezed his hand, and stepped inside alone. Alan, David, whoever he was, sat at the far end of the table, his hands folded in his lap, his posture stiff and uncertain. He looked up when she entered, and his expression was blank, polite, the look you give a stranger. Linda's breath caught in her throat. Isabel gestured to the chair across from him, and Linda sat down slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table to keep them from shaking. She tried to speak, but no sound came out at first. Finally, she managed a single word. "Alan?" He blinked, tilted his head slightly, and said, "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The question landed like a physical blow. Linda had prepared herself for this possibility. Dr. Ellison and Isabel had both warned her that memory loss was likely, that the man who came back might not remember the life he'd left, but hearing it, seeing the genuine confusion in his eyes, was something else entirely. She reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out a photograph, one from their 20th anniversary trip to the coast, the two of them standing on the boardwalk, with the ocean glittering behind them, both of them smiling, happy, whole. She slid it across the table. Her voice shook when she spoke. "This is us," she said. "This is you. Your name is Alan Foster. You're my husband. Alan. David. picked up the photograph and studied it for a long time, his eyes moving over the faces, the background, the details. Finally, he looked up at her and his voice was soft and heartbreakingly sincere. "I don't remember this," he said. "I'm sorry. I don't remember any of it." Over the next several days, doctors ran a battery of tests. MRIs revealed evidence of an old traumatic brain injury, scar tissue in the right temporal lobe, consistent with a significant blow to the head. The neurologist, a specialist brought in from the State University Hospital, explained that the temporal lobe played a critical role in memory formation and retrieval, and that damage there could result in retrograde amnesia, the inability to recall events from before the injury occurred. Alan couldn't tell them how he'd sustained the injury. He didn't remember being in a car accident. He didn't remember being assaulted. He didn't remember anything. The earliest memory he could reliably access was waking up on the shoulder of a highway with a pounding headache and no identification, no wallet, no sense of who he was or where he'd come from. A truck driver had stopped and offered him a ride, and Alan, who didn't know his name was Alan, had accepted. The truck driver had asked where he was headed, and Alan had said he didn't know, so the driver had dropped him off in Rivermouth and wished him luck. From there, Alan had stumbled into a homeless shelter and begun the long, slow process of building a life from nothing. He hadn't reported himself missing because, as far as he knew, no one was missing him. He had no memory of Linda, no memory of Kyle, no memory of the house on Maple Ridge or the wedding he'd been driving to or the navy and silver tie he'd been wearing when he left. He had no memory of his own name. The truth, when investigators finally pieced it together, was simpler and sadder than anyone had imagined. Isabel Tran, working with State Highway Patrol, reviewed traffic reports from June 7, 2014, the day Alan disappeared. Buried in the archives was a report of a hit-and-run incident logged that morning on the highway overpass that connected the suburb to the main road, the exact route Alan would have taken to get to the church. The report noted that a vehicle had been involved in a collision with another vehicle and that the at-fault driver had fled the scene. No victim's car had been located at the time, and no injuries had been reported, so the case had been filed and largely forgotten. Isabel theorized that Alan had been involved in that collision, that the impact had caused him to lose control of his vehicle, and that he'd sustained a head injury severe enough to cause amnesia. Disoriented and confused, he'd likely abandoned his car. Perhaps it had gone off the road into a ditch or ravine where it wasn't immediately visible, and had wandered away on foot, eventually hitchhiking north. The hit-and-run driver had never been identified, and likely never would be. But at least now they had a framework, a probable sequence of events that explained, if not everything, then enough. But the tie, the navy and silver tie that had started this whole search 9 years later, held a darker truth. Kyle had found it 2 weeks before his mother got the call from Isabel Tran. He'd been walking through downtown on his lunch break from work when he passed a thrift store he'd never noticed before. A cramped little shop with racks of clothing crammed into every available space. Something had drawn him inside, boredom, curiosity, fate he didn't know, and he'd been idly flipping through a rack of ties near the back when he saw it, navy blue silk with thin silver threads. He'd frozen, his hand gripping the fabric, his heart pounding. He knew that tie. He'd seen his father wear it 100 times. He pulled it off the rack and examined it closely, and that's when he saw the stains. 3 dark streaks running across the silk near the knot, rust brown and stiff. Blood. Kyle bought the tie without asking the shopkeeper where it had come from, paid $5 in cash, and took it home. Alone in his room, he stared at it for hours, trying to make sense of it. Finally, he'd taken it to a private lab and paid for a basic DNA analysis. A week later, the results came back. The blood was human, but it didn't match Kyle's DNA, which meant it wasn't Alan's either. It was someone else's. Kyle didn't know what that meant, but he knew it mattered. When he finally met his father in that conference room, 6 days after Linda's first visit, Kyle brought the tie with him. He placed it on the table between them and asked, "Do you remember this?" Alan stared at the tie for a long time, his face going pale. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe. I found it in a bag when I first got to Rivermouth. I kept it. I don't know why. Sometimes I dream about it." He paused, his hands trembling. "About someone falling, about headlights, about trying to help, about blood." His voice cracked. "I don't know if it's real or just nightmares." The investigation into the blood took weeks. Isabel Tran submitted the tie as evidence, and the state crime lab processed it with the urgency the case now warranted. The DNA profile came back with a match in the national database, a man named Leonard Voss, a long-haul truck driver from Pennsylvania who'd been reported missing in June 2014. Leonard's route that month had taken him through Ohio on the same highway where Alan's hit-and-run had occurred. Leonard's family, his wife, his 2 adult children, his elderly mother, had never stopped searching for him, had never stopped hoping he'd come home. The news that his DNA had been found on Alan Foster's tie opened a painful new chapter for them, but it also offered something they hadn't had in 9 years: answers. Isabel coordinated with Pennsylvania authorities, and within days, search teams were dispatched to the area around the highway overpass. They found Leonard Voss's remains in a wooded ravine 50 feet below the road, his body partially concealed by overgrowth and debris. The medical examiner determined that Leonard had died from blunt force trauma consistent with a vehicle collision, and that he'd likely died within hours of the impact. Investigators theorized that the hit-and-run driver had struck Leonard's truck, causing it to veer off the road and plunge into the ravine. Alan, driving nearby or directly behind, had either witnessed the crash or come upon it moments later. He'd stopped to help, climbed down into the ravine, found Leonard injured and bleeding, and used his own tie to try to stop the bleeding. But Leonard's injuries had been too severe, and Alan, himself disoriented from a head injury sustained either in a secondary collision or while trying to help, had taken the tie with him when he fled the scene, not understanding what it meant or why he had it. The hit-and-run driver was never identified. The case remained open, but cold. Still, Leonard's family finally had closure, finally had a place to lay him to rest, and Alan, in the fragments of his recovered memory and the shadows of his nightmares, finally had context for the images that had haunted him for 9 years. The aftermath unfolded slowly, carefully, with the measured caution of people learning to navigate a reality no one had prepared them for. Alan Foster moved back to Ohio, not to the house on Maple Ridge. That would have been too much, too overwhelming, but to a small apartment on the other side of town. Linda visited often, bringing photo albums and mementos, telling stories about their life together, answering his questions with patience and grace. Alan listened, studied the photographs, tried to remember, but the memories didn't return, not in any complete or coherent way. Occasionally he'd get flashes, a scent that felt familiar, a song that stirred something deep and wordless, but nothing solid, nothing he could hold on to. Therapy helped. A psychologist specializing in traumatic brain injury worked with Alan twice a week, helping him process the profound dissonance of being told he had a whole life he couldn't remember, helping him grieve for a past he'd lost and a present he was struggling to inhabit. Dr. Ellison continued working with Linda, helping her navigate the complicated terrain of loving someone who didn't remember loving her back, helping her let go of the expectation that things would return to the way they were. They wouldn't. They couldn't. But maybe, with time and patience, they could build something new. Kyle visited his father less often than Linda did. The reunion he'd imagined for 9 years, the embrace, the apologies, the explanations, the restoration, hadn't looked like this. The grief of losing his father twice, once to disappearance and once to amnesia, was more than he knew how to carry. But slowly, tentatively, they began to build a relationship. Not father and son in the traditional sense, but two men learning to know each other from scratch, finding common ground in small things, a shared love of old westerns, a mutual appreciation for bad puns, a quiet understanding of what it meant to lose yourself and have to start over. Kyle kept the tie, cleaned and pressed and stored in a box in his closet. It was evidence and memorial and mystery, a reminder of the fragility of memory and the weight of unanswered questions. Alan testified in the case involving Leonard Voss, helping investigators piece together the final hours of Leonard's life. He met Leonard's daughter, a woman named Rebecca, who looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow and thanked him for trying to save her father. She told him it meant more than he could know, that her family had spent 9 years not knowing if Leonard had suffered, if he'd been alone, if anyone had tried to help. Now they knew. Someone had tried. Alan hadn't been able to save Leonard, but he'd been there, and that mattered. Rebecca hugged him, and Alan cried for a man he couldn't remember but whose blood he'd carried for 9 years. The house on Maple Ridge eventually sold. Linda couldn't live there anymore, couldn't walk past Alan's empty chair, or sleep in the bed they'd shared, or wake up every morning to the ghost of a life that no longer existed. She moved into a smaller place with a garden she tended carefully, planting flowers that bloomed in cycles, reminding her that even after long winters, growth was still possible. Kyle graduated from community college and started working at a non-profit organization that helped families of missing persons navigate the legal, emotional, and logistical challenges of ambiguous loss. He turned his own grief into a lifeline for others, and it gave him purpose, gave him a way to make meaning out of suffering. Alan Foster continued to live quietly in his small apartment, working part-time at a bookstore, attending therapy, slowly building a new life in the shadow of one he couldn't remember. He kept the framed photograph Linda had given him, the one from the boardwalk, the ocean glittering behind them, on a shelf in his living room. He didn't remember the day it was taken, didn't remember the trip or the anniversary, or the feel of Linda's hand in his. But he kept it anyway, a piece of evidence that joy had existed once, that love had been real, and that even if he couldn't remember it, it had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The navy and silver tie remained in Kyle's possession, a relic of two men who'd vanished on the same stretch of highway 9 years earlier, and two families who'd spent nearly a decade searching. It was evidence of a tragedy, a memorial to a stranger's final moments, and a mystery stitched together with threads too fine to see, but strong enough to connect the living and the dead across time and distance and the unbridgeable gaps of memory. And though the hit-and-run driver was never found, though some questions would remain forever unanswered, the families of Alan Foster and Leonard Voss had something they hadn't had before: truth, closure, and the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, someone had tried to help, someone had cared, and love, however fragmented, however forgotten, had endured.